Okay, everybody, welcome back to our second little mini lecture video of this first module where we're covering the five core ideas of the helping approach called behavior theory. One of the things, by the way, I did not mention in the first video, but let me go ahead and mention it here. Behavior theory is a helping approach that we see really in all kinds of areas of social services. We see the core ideas of behavior theory used in substance abuse and mental health counseling. We see it in working with children and adolescents and families. And it doesn't mean that this is the best theory or the only theory that we draw from, but it is a core foundational theory when it comes to psychology and counseling. That's why we kind of camp out around it in this class. I always tell people that behavior theory is something that all of us kind of can connect to because all of us know about behavior. That's what you and I, that's all we do all day long is engage in behavior. And we're around people that all day long that's all they do is engage in behavior. We're going to talk more about that here in just a second. So this is a theory that a lot of people can kind of connect to. You know, a lot of times you may take a theories class and you hear the professor talk about a certain theory and it doesn't really connect. It's hard maybe to even understand sometimes. But behavior theory is pretty straightforward, and because it focuses on behavior, it's something that most of us can relate to because most of us know about human behavior because we're humans and we behave, right? So in our first video, you've already watched, I hope, we talked about how the first core idea of behavior theory is that human behavior has three forms. It is what we do, what we say, and what we think. Human behavior is verbal behavior, physical behavior, and cognitive behavior. And then also too, human behavior can be both covert and overt. It can be out in the open, easily observable, physical, verbal. It can also be covert, kind of covered up. That would be more cognitive, right? So we've already covered all that. Let's talk about the next couple of core ideas. We have five we want to cover total, right? So first core idea, human behavior has three forms. Here's idea number two. Human behavior is always happening. You can't understand behavior theory unless you kind of understand this idea that this theory takes what's called air quotes here, a positive view of human behavior. Does that mean that all human behavior is good for us? No. The word positive here means present. Human behavior is always happening. In other words, you and I cannot not act. We are always engaged in some form of human behavior. And so that's another important core idea. It's the second idea that we want to kind of just cover very, very, very quickly when it comes to this idea of what are the core ideas of this theory, right? So here's kind of the thing. One of the things that people may think is they may say to you and me, for example, we sometimes use this language. What did I do? What did we do in class last night? We didn't do anything. What did I do this weekend? Nothing. Just sat on the couch and watched TV, just looked at movies, went online, went on Facebook. That's all I did. Well, from a behavior standpoint, you did a lot. We sometimes talk as if we don't do anything. This theory says that's impossible. We're always engaged in behavior, even when we don't think we are, right? So sometimes we talk as if we are not doing something. Usually when we talk, we use that kind of language like this. What did we do in class last night? Nothing. When we talk like that, what we really mean is we did not do anything that I value, right? So we didn't do anything. Well, in reality, you did a lot in your class last night. What did you do this weekend? From a behavioral standpoint, you did a lot. Even if all you did was sat on the couch for 2 straight days and watched movies. Physically, verbally, and cognitively, you were engaged in behavior probably the entire time. So behavior theory takes this positive view of human behavior. It's always happening. Behavior is always happening. Occasionally, you know, you'll have people who you'll interact with clients or with students or whatever, and they'll say, well, he's not doing anything, I'm not doing anything, we're not doing anything. And we use this language as if it's possible for us to not engage in behavior. This theory says, it's a second core idea, that we're always engaged in some form of behavior or not. A few years ago, we had a presenter come and speak in one of our human service student organization meetings. And it was a very, very interesting presentation. And one of the things he talked about it wasn't the focus of his presentation, but he talked about sleep studies and how with depression and how people with depression and bipolar disorder, but especially depression, people's sleep can be really messed up. People can have insomnia or hypersomnia, they're tired a lot. And he was given examples of a clinic where he used to work where they would do sleep studies. And he kept using this phrase over and over again. He kept using the phrase sleep behavior, sleep behavior. And finally, a student raised their hand and they said, when you say sleep behavior, you mean like sleeping, right? He said, yeah. He said, sleep is behavior. We don't think about it as being behavior because we think if I'm asleep, I'm laying in bed, conked out, hopefully, and I'm not moving or doing anything. So therefore, I'm not engaged in behavior. And he kind of highlighted how actually, from a behavioral standpoint, even when we're sound asleep in bed, sleep really is behavior, even though we're sitting still, because we're always engaged in behavior. So the first core idea of this theory is human behavior has three forms: physical, verbal, cognitive. Second idea, this theory takes a positive view of human behavior, which means we're always acting. We cannot not act. So that's the second core idea. Behavior is always happening. Let's talk about the third core idea. We've covered 1 and 2. You can tell we're going to hit these, kind of quick here. They're real basic. Here's the third idea. One of the things that makes theories, different counseling theories, stand out and be distinct one from another is some theories put emphasis on certain things and they de-emphasize other things. Now, when we say they de-emphasize something, it doesn't mean they ignore it. It just means they're more interested in something else than this. So for example, I mentioned Freud in my last little lecture video. Freud's theory was called psychoanalytic theory. Freud's theory emphasized, it makes a big deal about our childhood. So if you know much about Freud's theory, Freud believed that our experiences, my experiences, your experiences in childhood are really, really important to who you are and who I am right now. He emphasized the past. He emphasized childhood. He de-emphasizes other things. But he made every theory has some things it makes a big deal about and some other things it's less interested in. Let's cover something that this theory, behavior theory, is not as interested in as other people are sometimes. This theory, third core idea is this: a de-emphasis on labels. Now, a label is just a verbal term that we use all the time in our conversation. We often use labels as we describe ourselves or other people. We say, yeah, she's really shy. He's really, she struggles with low self-esteem. He's really hyper. She's really controlling. He's really lazy. We use these broad labels oftentimes. And what we mean when we use those labels, now labels are not wrong per se, but labels are oftentimes just a quick way for us to quickly, just very simply put just kind of a real quick umbrella term over a lot of different behaviors. Well, behavior theory does not believe that labels are wrong, but it de-emphasizes the labels, right? What behavior theory is more interested in is this: what is the specific verbal, cognitive, or physical behavior someone's engaging in, not the label. So with behavior theory, the phrase we use is we want to get behind the label. So when someone says, well, she's just really controlling, well, what does that mean? I mean, do I know what that means? Do you know what you haven't really told me anything specifically about what she's doing. If someone says to you, yeah, my son is really hyper. Well, like what? Hyper is this broad term, lazy, control. They're very, very broad terms. They don't really tell us specifically what people are doing. And so that's why we oftentimes as helpers have to say, hey, can you give me an example of that? For those of you who are going to go into counseling, you're going to find yourself as you work with your clients, asking them to just give you more information. Hey, can you give me an example of that? Can you tell me kind of what you mean? Because clients talk in labels all the time. They say, yeah, I've had just a really crazy week. Well, what does that mean? Okay, wow. Like, give me and so we just oftentimes politely ask, hey, give me an example. Well, she's really kind of out of control right now. Out of control. It's a label. Oh, really? So what's going on? Tell me, can you give me an example of that? I'm really, whatever. So people oftentimes use these labels. So labels are not wrong in and of themselves, but here are 3 real quick reasons why we want to be careful about labels, and why behavior theory is more interested in what's behind the label. Number 1, labels are not specific. They're general. And so they're kind of vague. And so we want to make sure that we know, we want to be specific as far as about behavior, as far as what people are doing or not doing. Labels are also subjective, and subjective has to do with perception. So what I mean when I say, yeah, she's really controlling, may be different from what you mean when you say, yeah, she's really controlling. So subjective means two different definitions. So labels are not specific, they are subjective. And then they're often what we call pejorative. Pejorative just means negative. They're often judgmental. And we want to be careful about that. We want to be careful about using labels to put people down and put a negative judgment on top of people, right? So labels are not wrong, but behavior theory is just more interested in not the label, but what specifically are people doing or not doing. I kind of came into the field many, many years ago as a child and adolescent counselor. So I worked in my first job where I was working. We had contracts with both CPS and a local school district, special ed especially. So I had a lot of kids and families I would work with who would come from CPS and come from school districts. And we had a referral form that the person referring the kids to my clinic would fill out. And they would give me the name and the birth date and kind of what we call the presenting problem. And it was very, very common. Like the majority of the time I would get a referral, and the referral was pretty general, and usually it used all kinds of labels. ADHD, bipolar, out of control, sometimes they'd say, well, whatever. There were all kinds of labels, right? And when I would meet with the family or with the child for the first time, especially the family, I found myself many, many, many times, it sounds terrible, I would throw the referral form away, and I would say, hey, tell me what's going on. So what's going on? What can I help you all with? And people would often say, well, he's having a hard time in school. I have no idea what that means. But I would say, okay, can you give me, and I just ask for, can you give me like an example of that? Well, and then they'll say, well, he doesn't get along well with other kids. Okay, see again, I don't know what that means. Can you give me like specifically an example of when you say he doesn't get along well? Give me like an example. And we often have to ask that because we need specific information. We need specific examples. The more specific, the better, right? So behavior theory came along at a time when Freud's theory was real big. And the developers of behavior theory were a little bit turned off by kind of what was happening with Freud's psychoanalytic theory, where there was all these diagnoses and all these terms and all, neurosis and neurotic and analysis and repression, all these general broad terms. And what behavior theorists realized is, those terms mean like 90 different things to 90 different people sometimes, right? And so the behaviorists came along and said, we're not interested in those labels. Although we're not saying they're wrong, what we want to know is specifically, what are people doing? What are people not doing? I mentioned in the intro video that our little green textbook we use in this class is called Understanding Applied Behavior Analysis, ABA. We're not going to talk a whole lot about ABA in this class, but I'll just give you this as an example. ABA is a specific behavior modification approach that we use a lot with children with autism spectrum disorder. And if you go towards the back of the book, especially, the author gives you a great little overview of kind of how ABA works. In my experience with ABA, one of the things I like about ABA is built on specifics. Specifically, what are we wanting to see different? Specifically, what behavior is this child engaging in consistently? Not generally, specifically. Let's look at it from an objective standpoint and see What is this child doing well? What are they not doing well specifically? And when it comes to making a plan for change, it's not going to be a broad plan. We just want him to act better. Well, what does that mean? No, we're going to be specific. We're going to try to increase, here's a specific behavior. And we want this child to do more of that. And here's how we're going to do that. Here's a specific behavior. We want to see a decrease in that in the next month or 3 months or whatever. And here's how we're going to do that. Real concrete, real specific. And so this idea of kind of getting behind the label is so important. So that's the third core idea. Real quick review. Core idea number 1, behavior theory has 3 forms. Human behavior has 3 forms. Physical, verbal, cognitive. What we think, what we say, and what we do. Second thing is, behavior theory says that we are always engaged in some form of human behavior. It takes a positive view of human behavior. And then third idea is that this theory places a de-emphasis on behavioral labels, and instead we're more interested in the specific verbal, physical, or cognitive behavior that people are engaged in. We're more interested in the behavior and not the label. Okay, so next video we've covered 3. I'm not real good at math, but I think 3 and 5. So we got 2 more. We got core idea number 4, core idea number 5 in the next video. And that's what our focus is in this first module, is making sure we have these core ideas down pat. All right, so come back to the next video and I'll see you then. All right.